Was Saturn the sun? Seems like a good question. Was Saturn the sun in ancient times, or seen in history and mythology, skies, as the sun-like object? The Saturn theory, through comparative mythology, Roman Saturnalia festival, etc., suggests that Saturn may have been our first sun, or at least associated as our star. This is explored through David Talbot's Saturn myth, and perhaps starting to be explained through the Saturnian cosmologies of the Thunderbolt's electric universe theory, Alfred de Grazia, and other Immanuel Velikovsky-inspired catastrophism models and revised chronology. These diagrams of some proposed Saturn polar configurations may help visualize initially mind-bending concepts. The Sun and Saturn are two very different celestial objects, yet the Babylonians appeared to confuse the two. Or was it just the translators of the Babylonian texts? Thomson, in his introduction to his collection of astrological reports, has noticed that the planet Saturn was also designated as Samas, i.e., sun, by the Babylonian Assyrian astrologers, and he quotes the statement of Hyginus to the effect that Saturn was called the star of the sun. Sun and catastrophism. Saturn was named after the Roman god of agriculture and harvest. While the planet may have gotten its name from its golden color, like a field of wheat, it also had to do with its position in the sky. According to mythology, the god Saturn stole the position of king of the gods from his father Uranus. The throne was then stolen by Jupiter. Mythology of Planets, Universe Today.
Chonjiwang.
The Chonjiwang Bonpuri Chronicles of Shanjilong is a Korean creation myth, traditionally retold by shamans in the small island of Jeju-do. Despite its title, the supreme deity Chijjiwang, whose name means king of the heavens and of earth, serves mainly as a secondary character. The protagonists of the myth are instead the two sons of Shanjiwang, Great Star and Small Star. Chonjiwang Bonpuri, Wikipedia. Other peoples' EU variations also suggest different solar system configurations in our planet's recent history. Our gas giants, that are brown dwarf-type stars everywhere else, and other planets perhaps usurping other planet kings for a short period, or reflecting and basking in their glory. During Saturnalia festival period, around Christmas time, the roles of Roman households were reversed, with slaves becoming the master, in remembrance of when Saturn recently ruled the skies. It was a golden age. In a poem about a lavish Saturnalia under
Domitian,
Statius makes it clear that the emperor, like Jupiter, still reigns during the temporary return of Saturn, king of Saturnalia, Wikipedia. And the overthrow of Saturn symbolizes the demise of the old culture which worshipped this ancient god. According to Roman mythology, after Saturn was dethroned by his son Jupiter, Zeus, he hid himself, Latuit, in the countryside, called Latium, in his honor. At the invitation of the god Janus, he reigned together with his wife. Is that her name, really? Ops, over Rome's golden ages, bringing prosperity, abundance, and civilization. The Romans nostalgized that legendary state as the golden age of Latium. Many of the rites of the Saturnalia were intended to restore that long-lost utopia, if only for a short time each year. Saturnalia recalling an ancient age. Was Saturn the original sun? Was Saturn a brown dwarf star, where planet Earth resided during the Golden Age? Perhaps during the Saturn polar configuration. And yet the profile of the great sun gods presents a fascinating dilemma. During the past century, several authorities noticed that Greek and Latin astronomical texts show a mysterious confusion of the sun, Greek Helios, Latin Sol, with the outermost planet, Saturn. Though the designation seems bizarre, the expression star of Helios or star of Sol was applied to Saturn. Of the Babylonian star worshippers, the chronicler Diodorus writes, "To the one we call Saturn they give a special name, sun star." Similarly, the Greek historian Nonus, gives Kronos as the Arab name of the sun. Though Kronos meant only Saturn and no other celestial body, Hyginus, in listing the planets, names first Jupiter, then the planet of Sol. Others say Saturn. A Greek ostracon, cited by the eminent classicist Franz Boll, identifies the Egyptian sun god Ra, not with our sun, but with the planet Saturn. This repeated confusion of the sun and Saturn seems to make no sense at all. Can you imagine any difficulty in separating the two bodies, or distinguishing the one from the other? One fact beyond dispute is that the word Helios did come from the Greek word for our sun, just as the Latin Sol gave his name to our sun. The same can be said for the older Shamash and Ra. The names of these gods became the names of the solar orb. But that's where the connection with our sun ends, and the mystery of Saturn, the universal monarch, begins. As strange as it may seem, early astronomical traditions identify the primeval sun as the planet Saturn, the distant planet which alchemists called the best sun, and which the Babylonians, the founders of astronomy, identified as the exemplary light of heaven, the sun god Shamash. Shamash is the planet Saturn. The astronomical texts say, in archaic copies of Plato's Timaeus, the word for the planet Saturn is Helios, the sun god. Popular Greek tradition identified Saturn as Kronos, alter ego of Helios, and Kronos is said to have ruled over the pole. But only a handful of scholars have bothered to trace the parallel reference in other cultures, or to address the unanswered questions. Saturn in ancient times, thunderbolts. Picture of the day. The Popol Vuh, lauded as the Mayan Bible, attests to the same idea. There, a previous sun god is described as follows. Like a man was the sun when it showed itself. We've heard this before. It showed itself when it was born and remained fixed in the sky like a mirror. Certainly it was not the same sun which we see, it is said in their old tales. The Saturn myth, maverick science. A golden race of mortal men who lived in the time of Kronos, when he was reigning in heaven, and they lived like gods, without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil. Miserable age rested not on them. What happened to them? Works and Days, Hesiod, Velikovsky Archive. Peoples that remembered early tragedies enacted in the sky by the heavenly bodies asserted that Jupiter drove Saturn away from its place in the sky. Before Jupiter, Zeus became the chief god. Saturn, Kronos, occupied the celestial throne. And in all ancient religions, the dominion passes from Saturn to Jupiter. In Greek mythology, Kronos is presented as the father and Zeus as his son, who dethrones him. Kronos devours some of his children. After this act, Zeus overpowers his father, puts him in chains, and drives him from his royal station in the sky. In Egyptian folklore or religion, the participants of the drama are said to be Osiris, Saturn, brother and husband of Isis, Jupiter, the worship of Saturn in the beginning, Emmanuel Velikovsky, and I've read that. I may read it again. Here is a remarkable fact. Though numerous figures of the universal monarch are translated conventionally as the sun god, the celestial power invoked by the world's first religion is not the body we call the sun today. In fact, the star worshippers specifically distinguished it from our sun by calling it best sun, the primeval sun, the central sun. There has to be something to it. Of course, you know, the water and oxygen and salt matched as well on the scientific side. Natives of Mexico recall that prior to the present age, an exemplary sun ruled over the world. But this was not the sun of today. His name, Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl. The Maya maintained essentially the same idea, calling the primeval sun Hurricane. The Incas of Peru spoke of a former superior sun to the present sun. The ancient Egyptians, the sun god Atum-Ra, the model ruler, reigned over the fortunate area for a time, then retired from the world. The Sumerian An, ruling with terrifying splendor, was the central luminary in the sky, but not our sun, and later departed to a more remote domain. When it comes to the well-known sun gods of early man, nothing in the mythical record seems to have unnerved the experts. As to the original solar character of the Greek Helios, Latin Sol, Assyrian Shamash, or Egyptian Ra, scholars have maintained an unwavering confidence. And surely you can see why. Could it really be doubted that Helios, radiating light from his brow, is our sun? Saturn, the ancient sun god, David Talbot. Saturn did not move on its present remote orbit, but ruled as the central sun around which the other heavenly bodies visually revolved. The words used by ancient civilizations that are interpreted today as the sun, like the Egyptian Ra, the Greek Helios, and the Roman Sol, all originally referred to the gas giant Saturn. Was that planet our primordial parent? Was Saturn until recently a much larger brown dwarf? The apparent size and color of an electric star is an electrical phenomenon. If Jupiter's magnetosphere was lit up, it would appear the size of the full moon. Was ancient man around to see it as a sun? If not, why would anyone call a faint yellowish speck in the night sky the sun? Other stars, other worlds, other life, hollow science. Kronos was confused with, or perhaps consciously identified with, due to the similarity in name, the Titan Kronos, already in antiquity, the identification becoming more widespread during the Renaissance, giving rise to the allegory of Father Time wielding the harvesting scythe or sickle. He was depicted in Greco-Roman mosaics as a man turning the zodiac wheel, Kronos. However, also be contrasted with the deity Ion as eternal time. Kronos is usually portrayed through an old wise man with a long gray beard, such as Father Time. In Greek mythology, Kronos, in pre-Socratic philosophical works, is said to be the personification of time. He emerged from the primordial chaos. He is often mythologically confused with the Titan Kronos. He was depicted in Greco-Roman mosaics as a man turning the zodiac wheel, Often the figure is named Eon, eternal time, a common alternate name for the god. His name actually means time, and is alternatively spelled Chronos, Khronos, transliteration of the Greek Chronos, or Cronus, Latin version, Saturn in mythology. Now, even though Velikovsky points out that Saturn was once much more massive body than it is today, it is hard to imagine that it could have been massive enough to be a star, in the context of the thermonuclear theory of stellar energy. If, however, it was an electrically fueled star, its initial stellar state and its sudden demise seem readily explainable. Ralph Jurgens, Earth is a Satellite of Saturn, Velikovsky Archive. In fact, it may well be both Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn were at one time minor stars, and that their satellite systems were formed as the result of minor or planetary nova outbursts. CER.
There's nothing to fear. The gas giant Saturn. It's the outermost planet visible to the naked eye, moving on an orbit almost 900 million miles from the Sun. For those untrained in finding planets in the night sky, it could hardly be said that Saturn stands out amongst its starry companions. This lack of distinction underscores an unsolved mystery. Where did all of the extravagant images attached to this distant speck in the sky come from? The story of Saturn as creator. Saturn presiding over a lost golden age. Saturn as a primeval sun. Saturn's preposterous location at the celestial pole around which the heavens visually turn. Saturn as the founding father of kings. And Saturn as dying or displaced God. In due course, we'll take up the god's connection to an immense crescent, seen as a scythe or sickle turning in the sky. So too the cosmic mountain, from which Saturn was said to have once ruled the world. And the planet god's role as divine ancestor of different nations, all recounting the same core idea. The mysteries will quickly overwhelm a researcher the moment he asks the present sky to explain the ancient themes. In fact, many scholars simply walked away from the dilemma. Here's the dilemma in a nutshell. The myths appear to be much older than any recorded observations of planets. The first flowering of the monumental civilizations occurred in an environment of myth and magic. There are no lists of planets, no diaries of planetary motions. The celebrated gods do not look at all like the planets we know so well today. So most scholars simply state that planetary behavior could not have provoked any of the great myths. The attachment of myths to planets must have come much later, perhaps in the first millennium BC. Our message, however, is that a radically different planetary arrangement prevailed in an earlier time. Planets, not in their present orbits, but planets, provoked all of the mythic archetypes. What we're offering in this series are reasons for known facts, things not disputed. This includes the fact that the astronomer priests themselves, in recording the tranquil and predictable motions of planets in later times, named these bodies explicitly as the great gods of the primeval epoch. And that's the heart of the dilemma. Why does the behavior of these most venerated gods so boldly contradict all observations of the named planets today? By working with the points of cross-cultural agreement, we'll see that the astronomical images of Saturn connect theme by theme with an archaic story told around the world, told long after most cultures had lost track of any planetary connections. The story says that in a former time, a central luminary, a motionless sun, turned as a great wheel in the sky. But why an identification with the planet Saturn? It's said that this ancient power, the father of kings, presided over an age of natural abundance and cosmic harmony. But this story, in its countless variations, does not end well. It states that the world fell into confusion when the ruling god fled the theater or tumbled from his appointed station. Then the hordes of chaos were set loose and all of creation slipped into a cosmic night, the gods themselves battling furiously in the heavens, the clash of the Titans. In the well-known Greek tradition, this was the story of the displaced god Kronos, the father of kings. Kronos was the Greek name for the planet Saturn. And yet, enigmatically, the same planet was also named Helios, the sun, a fact that has perplexed classical scholars for a century and a half. The shadow cast by Saturn reached across the millennia. Even today, our language retains the age-old cultural ambivalence toward this most ancient god. The word Saturnian expresses the splendor of the Golden Age, while the word Saturnine reflects the melancholy of paradise lost. Guesses as to explanations will never work, but an explanation based on systematic cross-cultural investigation will work, allowing a global story to mean what it says, even if that requires a measure of patience as verifiable pieces come one by one into a coherent picture of the ancient sky.
Saturn, so active in cosmic changes, was regarded by all mankind as the supreme god. Seneca says that Epigenes, who studied astronomy among the Chaldeans, estimates that the planet Saturn exerts the greatest influence upon all the movements of the celestial bodies. On becoming a nova, it ejected filaments in all directions, and the solar system became illuminated as if by 100 suns. It subsided rather quickly and retreated into faraway regions. Peoples that remembered early tragedies enacted in the sky by the heavenly bodies asserted that Jupiter drove Saturn away from its place in the sky. Before Jupiter, Zeus became the chief god. Saturn, Kronos, occupied the celestial throne. In all ancient religions, the dominion passes from Saturn to Jupiter. In Greek mythology, Kronos is presented as the father and Zeus as his son, who dethrones him. Kronos devours some of his children. After this act, Zeus overpowers his father, puts him in chains, and drives him from his royal station in the sky. If Egyptian folklore or religion, the participants of the drama are said to be Osiris, Saturn, brother and husband of Isis, Jupiter. The cult of Osiris and the mysteries associated with it dominated the Egyptian religion as nothing else. Every dead man or woman was entombed with observances honoring Osiris. The city of Abydos in the desert west of the Nile and northwest of Thebes was sacred to him. Sais in the delta, used to commemorate the floating of Osiris' body carried by the Nile into the Mediterranean, what made Osiris so deeply ingrained in the religious memory of the nation that his cult pervaded mythology and religion. Osiris' dominion before his murder by Seth was remembered as a time of bliss. According to the legend, Seth, Osiris' brother, killed and dismembered him. whereupon Isis, Osiris' wife, went on
Peregrinations.
to collect his dispersed members. Having gathered them and wrapped them together with swathings, she brought Osiris back to life. The memory of this event was a matter of yearly jubilation among the Egyptians. Osiris became lord of the netherworld, the land of the dead. A legend, a prominent part of the Osiris cycle, tells that Isis gave birth to Horus, whom she conceived from the already dead Osiris, and that Horus grew up to avenge his father by engaging Seth in mortal combat. In Egyptology, the meaning of these occurrences stands as an unresolved mystery. The myth of Osiris is too remarkable and occurs in too many divergent forms not to contain a considerable element of historic truth, wrote Sir Alan Gardner, the leading scholar in these fields. But what historical truth is it? Could it be of an ancient king upon whose tragic death the entire legend hinged? Wondered Gardner. But of such a king, not a trace has been found before the time of the pyramid texts. And in these texts, Osiris is spoken of without end. There he appears as a dead god or king or judge of the dead. But who was Osiris in real life? Asked Gardner. At times, he is represented to us as the vegetation which perishes in the floodwater, mysteriously issuing from himself. He is associated with brilliant light. After the life of studying Egyptian history and religion, Gardner confessed that he remained unaware of whom Osiris represented or memorialized. The origin of Osiris remains for me as insoluble mystery, nor could others in this field help him find the answer. The Egyptologist John Wilson wrote that it is an admission of failure that the chief cultural content of Egyptian civilization, its religion, its mythological features, again and again narrated and alluded to in the text and represented in statues and temple reliefs, is not understood. The astral meaning of Egyptian deities was not realized, and the cosmic events of their activities were not thought of. The prophet Ezekiel in the Babylon exile had a vision, the likeness of a man, but made of fire and amber, who lifted him by the lock of his hair and brought him to some darkened chamber where the ancients of the house of Israel, with censers in their hands, were worshipping idols portrayed upon the wall round about. Then the angel of the vision told him, "Thou shalt see greater abominations that they do." And he brought the prophet to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Next he showed him also Jews in the inner court of the Lord's house, with their back toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, that they worshipped the sun toward the east. The worship of the sun and the planets was decried by Jeremiah, a contemporary of Ezekiel. But what was this weeping for Tammuz? Tammuz was a Babylonian god. One of the months of the year, approximately coinciding with July, in the summer, was named in his honor. And by this very name, it is known in the present-day Hebrew calendar, Tammuz was the god that died and was then hidden in the underworld. His death was the reason for a fast, accompanied by lamentations of the women of the land. His finding or his return to life and resurrection were the motifs of the Passion. Tammuz was the god of vegetation, of the flood, and of seeds. The god Tammuz came from Armenia every year in his ark in the overflowing river, blessing the alluvium with new growth. In the month of Tammuz he was bound, and the liturgies speak of his having been drowned among flowers, which were thrown upon him as he sank beneath the waves of the Euphrates. The drowning of Tammuz was an occasion for wailing by women. The flood has taken Tammuz. The raging storm has brought him low. Of Tammuz It is also narrated that he was associated with brilliant light, with descent into the netherworld, visited by Ishtar, his spouse. Tammuz's death, his subsequent resurrection, or his discovery in the far reaches, but no longer brilliant, were the themes of the cult that was not just one of the mysteries, but the chief and paramount cult. The Osirian mysteries, the wailing for Tammuz, all refer to the transformation of Saturn during and following the deluge. Osiris was not a king, but the planet Saturn, Kronos of the Greeks, Tammuz of the Babylonians. The Babylonians called Saturn the star of Tammuz. After the deluge, Saturn was invisible. The sky was covered for a long time by clouds of volcanic dust. And the Egyptians cried for Osiris, and the Babylonians cried for Tammuz. Isis, Jupiter at that time, went in search of her husband, and Ishtar, also Jupiter at that early time, went to the netherworld to find her husband Tammuz. For a time Saturn disappeared, driven away by Jupiter, and when it reappeared, it was no longer the same planet. It moved very slowly. The disappearance of the planet Saturn in the netherworld became the theme of many religious observances, compromising liturgies, mystery plays, lamentations, and fasts. When Osiris was seen again in the sky, though greatly diminished, the people were frenzied by the return of Osiris from death. Nevertheless, he became king of the netherworld. In the Egyptian way of seeing the celestial drama, Isis, Jupiter, the spouse of Osiris, Saturn, wrapped him in swathings. Osiris was known as the swathed, the way the dead came to be dressed for their journey to the world of the dead, over which Osiris reigns. Similar rites were celebrated in honor of Adonis, who died and was resurrected after a stay in the Netherland, in the mysteries of Orpheus. Sir James G. Frazer, a collector of folklore, came to regard Osiris as a vegetation god. Likewise, he saw in the Babylonian Tammuz an equivalent of the Egyptian Osiris, a vegetation god, and carried away by this concept, wrote his The Golden Bow, built around the idea of the vegetation god that dies and is resurrected the following year. A few peoples, through consecutive planetary ages, kept fidelity to the ancient Saturn, or Kronos, or Brahma, whose age was previous to that of Jupiter. Thus the Scythians were called Uman Manda by the Chaldeans, people of Manda, and Manda is the name of Saturn. The Phoenicians regarded El Saturn as their chief deity. Eusebius informs us that El, a name used also in the Bible as a name for God, was the name of Saturn. In Persia, Saturn was known as Kevan or Kavan. The different names for God in the Bible reflect the process of going through many ages in which one planet superseded another and was again superseded by the next one in the celestial war. El was the name of Saturn, Adonis of the Syrians. The bewailed deity was also like Osiris, the planet Saturn. But in the period of the contest between the two major planets, Jupiter and Saturn, the appellative of the dual gods became Adonai, which means my lords. Then, with the victory of Jupiter, it came to be applied to him alone. Emanuel Velikovsky.
The cradle of life. And this gets back to the idea of the Garden of Eden period in man's memory. If you're a satellite orbiting within that anode glow, and this is not an outrageous idea because astronomers have suggested the same thing for red giants, that planets could actually orbit within that star because the atmosphere is such low density. In fact, we orbit in the sun's atmosphere, if you like, and it doesn't cause us any trouble. But within that glowing shell, the radiant energy received from that envelope is constant over the entire globe. The light from the plasmasphere is not reflected light, it's radiant energy. Brown dwarfs radiate blue and ultraviolet light even though they are cool at a temperature around 950 K. This is further evidence that we are looking at a mix of an electrical red anode glow and coronal ultraviolet blue end of the spectrum. There are no seasons, no tropics and no ice caps. A planet does not have to rotate, its axis can point in any direction and its orbit can be eccentric, and you'll still get this beautiful even temperature over the whole body. The radiant energy received by the planet will be strongest at the blue and red ends of the spectrum, so photosynthesis, which relies on red light, would be very active. The skylight would be a pale purple, which maybe is referred to by the classical purple dawn of creation. And I know that in Canberra we have this new arboretum, which is fantastic, and all of the new trees that are being planted are put in red plastic to start with. And I asked the head of the arboretum why they did that, and he said the plants grow much better in red light. Water molecules dominate the spectra of brown dwarfs. So you want to know where the Earth's water came from? The light on Earth was dim and purplish amid a continuous mist of water. No other bodies in the system were visible. And this is what Dave mentioned yesterday. This explains the abundant water on Earth and many satellites of the gas giant planets and the rings of Saturn. And the red light, warmth and water was ideally suited for giant ferns. It explains the gigantic lush vegetation found at the poles, fossilised as coal. Now the problem faced by life on planets orbiting a red star, I think you saw last night, which was this flaring red dwarf. So this tendency to flare up is a problem. The reason for this is that, as I said, the red stars don't have the current regulation afforded by the bright photosphere. So the response of a red star to a sudden electrical disturbance in their environment is to shed charged matter in a flare-up. They may also change in apparent size as the anode glow accommodates to the electrical environment. I think this would account for the great dyings in the geological record and the episodic deposit of vast sediment and mineral layers on the Earth. And on other bodies too. Every body that's been looked at is layered. What's more, it explains for the first time the oceans of salty water on Earth. Comets cannot be responsible because they have little or no water and little or no sodium chloride. Now just see how much of this I want to show you, because we saw this yesterday, so I might skip. This is referring to that super flare you saw yesterday, and you remember the astrophysicist said anyone who was on a planet orbiting that star at the time would be having a very bad day. Well, I think the Earth has had its bad days, and they're reflected in the geological record. So we'll skip that. The mass extinctions. As I said, those flare-ups can be so drastic that it would practically wipe out the life on any existing life on those satellites of that dwarf star. This raises an interesting side issue, and that is, ironically, intelligent life can't communicate through such a plasma shell using radio waves. So the lack of intelligible radio signals in the SETI project is understandable. In fact, denizens of such worlds would most likely be unaware of the universe at large. Now, astronomers also submit that orbiting a red dwarf is possibly one of the best places to look for life. What they've never considered is orbiting inside a red dwarf. Let me see. I don't think I'll talk about this one. This is a recent report of a spotty brown dwarf which suggests there are things orbiting within that red anode sheath, causing a dimming of the glow behind wherever that satellite happens to be. They're calling it weather, but of course if it's an anode glow it has nothing to do with weather. So we'll skip that. So this is a picture of the brown dwarf Proto-Saturn as I see it. Now there would have been many more bodies than you see there, but I've included Mars and Earth and Proto-Saturn because they're the main players at this stage. 50% of red dwarfs have Earth-sized planets in their conventional habitable zone. This suggests there are a large number hidden inside the red star's glow. And you can say that too because our gas giants all have large numbers of satellites orbiting quite closely. But you'll note there is no Venus at this stage. Gigantism. It wasn't just pterodactyls that struggled to get up off the ground. Scaling of muscle and bone strength shows that dinosaurs could not have raised their bodies off the ground in today's gravity. For them to move about, Earth's gravity needed to be about 1/3 of today's. Global extinction and fossilization requires far more than a simple impact. Clearly, we have no understanding of the cause of gravity. Is gravity electrical? The question is of fundamental importance for cosmology and our understanding of the solar system. And the answer should provide insights into the demise of the dinosaurs, the sky our ancestors saw, and why they feared doomsday.
Going to move right on into number 2. Hopefully it'll come up here on the end screen. I wouldn't doubt it if it's not there though. My end screens disappear all the time. Let's see. No end screen, see? Happens all the time. It should be coming up right now. Come out and say hello after. I can't respond. In the spring of 1955, Providence wished that the drama should heighten itself. The old chief of all pagans, the planet Jupiter, was destined to enter the scene and speak. It was a spring day in early April at Princeton. This is the time of year when magnolia flower and the Princeton campus has not a few of these trees, especially near the Firestone Library, profusely blooming. During the first week of April of that year, the meeting of the American Astronomical Society convened for 3 days in Princeton. In the university's chemical building, Frick Laboratories, I entered the auditorium during the reading of one of the papers, when the audience was already seated, and chose a place on one of the back benches, close to the entrance. I did not wish to disturb the convention by my presence, because, being recognized, I would have caused some discomfort. After listening to W. Bod and possibly one more speaker, I left as quietly as I entered. I did not return for the other papers. The program of the 3-day convention had 102 papers presented by astronomers from all over the country, but only one not scheduled, yet read because of the great impact it carried in the field of planetary astronomy, made news. The next day, April 6th, opening the New York Times, I found a page-length column on a sensational discovery reported at the meeting. The column read in parts, "Radio waves from the giant planet Jupiter have been detected by astronomers at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. The waves appear to be short bursts of static, much like those produced by thunderstorms on conventional radio receivers. No radio sounds from planets in our solar system have been reported previously." Oh, that's incorrect. Tesla reported getting them in the early 1900s. The existence of the mysterious Jovian waves was disclosed by Dr. Bernard F. Burke and Dr. Kenneth L. Franklin, hoity-toities, in a report today at a meeting of the American Astronomical Society. The two scientists said that they did not have an explanation for the observed emission. You know what those buggers say now? They say, "Everybody knows radio signals come from planets. That's no big deal." Yeah, in 2021 it's not, but in 1950 it was. They're so intellectually dishonest, it's repugnant. Princeton, New Jersey, April 6th. The discovery was made entirely by chance. When the Carnegie Institution astronomers scanned the sky for radio noises from faraway galaxies, in the news release it was told that Burke and Franklin, who detected the radio noises of Jupiter, were entirely unprepared to observe any radio signal from the planet. Later, their perplexity was more fully described. At one point, they even assumed that some revelers returning from a party were the cause, trying to start the engine of their car. I mean, you can tell they were so uncomfortable by the discovery that they weren't sure they even wanted to be the discoverers, because they were afraid of getting blackballed. They had to go through the hierarchy. Or that the radio noises were caused by some experiments on a neighboring radio station. But the noises were finally traced to Jupiter. In the weeks that followed, Burke and Franklin observed that the signals were arriving 4 minutes earlier each day, and at length they realized they must be of extraterrestrial origin. Every third night, for 6 minutes, when the receiving antenna was directed toward the spot crossed at these minutes by Jupiter, the signals repeated themselves. Then the astronomers of Washington came to the correct conclusion, unexpected and surprising as it was. For me, this news had special significance. My own earlier expectation of the noises of Jupiter was based on my view of the giant planet as the center of a powerful electromagnetic system. In ancient sources, the planet Jupiter was associated with thunderbolts. Before World War II, a discovery was made by Jansky of the Bell Laboratories that radio signals arrived from the Milky Way. During the war, it was discovered by the U.S. Army Signal Corps in Belmar, New Jersey, that the sun sends out radio noises too. It was a chance discovery made in the process of testing radar echoes from the moon. The radio noises were found arriving from faraway galaxies and were explained as crashes between galaxies riding through one another. A new science, radio astronomy, was born. My understanding of the nature of the sun and planets made me assume that these bodies are charged, or that at least their atmospheres are strongly ionized. Of Jupiter and Saturn, it is known that they influence, in some mysterious manner, the solar spot activity, but nobody thought that these bodies, or their atmospheres, are charged. Now, seeing my claims confirmed, I called Helen Dukas and told her that I would like to acquaint Professor Einstein with the discovery of the noises coming from Jupiter, and wished to see him for a few minutes only. We agreed that I should come Friday, April 8th, in the afternoon. Then I called my editor at Doubleday, Walter Bradbury, and told him that I would come the next day, in the morning. Already on the phone, I drew his attention to the column in the Times. My book, Earth and Upheaval, was being prepared for print, together with my lecture before the Forum of October 14, 1953, as a supplement, and this lecture contained my challenge that Jupiter would radiate radio signals. For several years I wished that a check should be made on Jupiter, and took this opportunity to suggest it to scientists. In my letter to Einstein, June 16, 1954, I again suggested that an investigation be performed. It was a challenge on my part to Einstein to stake the debate on this my claim, and at the same time a plea to help me that the test should be performed. Einstein did not respond in that instance. In a note made on the margin of my letter, he wrote, "This would be no criterion. This was not well thought through." Right, because he didn't have it. Either there must be on Jupiter a dissociation of negative and positive charges that would produce thunderstorms of unearthly magnitudes, or more likely the entire body of Jupiter is charged, surrounded by an electromagnetic field, and attracts opposite charges from space, yet by continuous subatomic processes of fission in the great discharges, or by some other process, keeps its general charge undiminished. The Forum lecture, a discussion of my thesis of 1950 in the light of new discoveries in the fields of archaeology, geology, astronomy, brought in its wake, even sooner than I dared to hope, a confirmation of a bold yet well-founded advanced claim. The discovery of Jupiter noises thrilled me, as had no other confirmation before, and it was the first of a long, spectacular series. Emmanuel Velkost.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. The parent star of planet Earth holds a strange and special place in countless ancient traditions around the world. This celestial body, identified as the sun in myth, religion, ancient astronomies, and rock art, routinely bears no resemblance at all to our familiar sun. One of the most common ancient depictions of the sun is an orb or star within a crescent, an image with no modern natural referent. And numerous traditions depict the sun as a spectacular celestial wheel, with a warrior hero appearing as the axle of the wheel. For decades, comparative mythologist Ev Cochrane, as well as his colleague David Talbot, have worked to reconstruct the natural events that produce these extraordinary mythical patterns. It is their conclusion that in the relatively recent past, in the era of prehistory, a period of instability reigned in the inner solar system, bringing planets within close proximity to Earth. In this episode, Ev begins our investigation into the question, did ancient man observe a different sun?
It is important to underscore the radical nature of our hypothesis. We hold that the solar system has only recently been subject to wholesale reordering, that in fact, well within the memory of mankind, a different sun prevailed. Our hypothesis is fundamentally a work of historical reconstruction based upon our mutual researches in comparative mythology and ancient religion. The research of Dave and myself is distinguished from other comparative mythologists in that we draw upon and emphasize the message of prehistoric rock art to illustrate our findings from literary traditions. To take but one example from hundreds that might be offered, ancient paintings and petroglyphs of the sun depict a wheel-like object, commonly 4 or 8-spoked in structure. Such artworks are global in nature. Yet how is this fact to be explained? From the conventional standpoint, such artworks are interpreted as abstract or metaphorical in nature. Miranda Green, for example, in her otherwise interesting book, The Sun Gods of Ancient Europe, concludes, "The pictures do not describe reality." We beg to differ. It is our view that the prehistoric paintings accurately reflect the appearance of the ancient sky and offer compelling testimony with regards to an unfolding catastrophic celestial event in which nearby planets dominated the northern circumpolar heavens. The mere fact that analogous sun petroglyphs will be found around the globe supports this conclusion. At the same time, ancient myth offers corroborating testimony in this regard, wherein a different sun dominated the sky in former times and presented a wheel-like appearance. In this sense, as in countless other examples, the testimony of ancient myth and prehistoric rock art agrees at a level of detail that is impossible to explain by mere coincidence. In the Thunderbolts of the Gods, together with a number of other recent publications, Dave and myself have presented a wealth of evidence that the former sun was the focus of prodigious electrical activity and the source of spectacular outbursts of lightning, heaven-spanning storms, and aurora-like phenomenon. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, the Sumerian word for sun is Ud. The same word is employed to write storm or thunder god, a startling extension of meaning. Sumerian hymns invoking the ancient sun god likewise describe it as a source of storms. So one hymn reads, "The sun god thunders over the mountains like a storm." Another hymn reads, "As my king the sun god comes forth, the heavens tremble before him and the earth shakes before him." Now I ask, does this sound like a realistic description of the modern experience of sunrise? In what sense is the sun's appearance over the eastern horizon ever accompanied by a shaking of heaven and earth or great bouts of lightning? What could the sun have to do with thunder and lightning? In the present solar system, of course, the answer is nothing at all. Yet the mere fact that other ancient languages preserve this very same semantic link between sun and lightning confirms the fundamental historical veracity of the Sumerian traditions and cries out for an explanation. Ancient Egypt, for example, offers corroborating testimony in this regard. In the pyramid text from the 3rd millennium BCE, the sun god's thunderbolt is specifically compared to the lightnings of the sun. The word in question here is mut, M-A-W-T, which has cognates denoting lightning in numerous other African languages. Significantly, however, the very same word is used to denote the spokes of a wheel. In the present world, of course, lightning has nothing whatsoever to do with the sun or wheels, hence the fundamental importance of such terminology for our historical reconstruction. But we need not rely simply on ancient language and myth alone. Mesopotamian cylinder seals, together with prehistoric rock art and other early artworks, likewise depict the sun with lightning-like structures emanating from its core. Students of comparative myth will recognize the structure adorning the face of the sun here as the thunderbolt wielded by the thunder god. So, for example, thunder gods like Zeus or the Semitic Adad are routinely depicted holding exactly this thunderbolt. Properly understood, the evidence from ancient language, like the testimony of prehistoric rock art, represents an enduring fossilized record of a different solar system, much as the discovery of a dinosaur bone harks back to its former age, one radically different from that which currently prevails. It must be remembered here that the denigration of myth is a relatively recent development, basically originating during the early decades of the 20th century. The science of comparative mythology, like the complementary science of comparative linguistics, grew out of the 19th century writings of world-class scholars such as Max Müller and Adalbert Kuhn, who rightly emphasized the prominent role of the sun and the thunder god in ancient myth and religion. Yet the excesses of these schools, together with that of the Pan-Babylonians, led to a general backlash against naturist or astronomical interpretations of myth and religion. Current models of myth, such as that advanced by George Dumézil, which dominates scholarship, emphasize linguistic connections above all else and are much more narrow-minded in scope. For example, Dumézil largely focuses on Indo-European myth. Most important, perhaps, is the fact that current models of myth always seek to understand the ancient traditions by reference to the present sky. But the ancient testimony is impossible to square with the present solar system. And as a result, scholars are left with empty slogans pointing to figurative language, metaphor, and such statements as that of Green, quoted earlier, to the effect that the pictures do not describe reality. As Dave and I have documented, however, granted the fact that the ancient traditions and prehistoric rock art complement each other, it therefore stands to reason that they do indeed describe historical reality. Confronted by these sun wheels, for example, on ancient rock art, the default position of so many modern scholars is just to ascribe those artworks to imagination or abstract forms, completely overlooking the fact that the same exact design is found all over the world. So at that point, you need to ask yourself a question: were ancient sky watchers on every continent on the earth imagining the same fantastic structure in the sky, which in this case is just a cross on the face of the sun or a lightning bolt on the face of the sun? But we could cite 1,000 other structures that we could describe if we wanted to. We're just trying to focus the discussion on these particular structures at the moment. But are we supposed to imagine that all these sky watchers all around the globe were imagining the same thing? That is not a logically sound position. It's much more rational to assume that the ancient sky watchers were trying to describe their personal reality. They drew the picture of the sun that they saw, and that's why those pictures agree all around the world. Things that are imagined are not going to agree unanimously around the world. It's just that simple.
Various plasma instabilities are found on Jupiter. NASA launched the Juno spacecraft on August 5, 2011. Its primary mission includes analysis of Jupiter's massive plasmasphere. How do its electromagnetic influences affect the Jovian system? Since Jupiter radiates more energy than it receives from the Sun, astronomers think that some kind of internal dynamo, acting like a generator, must be creating the excess. However, there are processes occurring on Jupiter that are now coming to light. Jupiter is an electrically active world, far more than computer simulations predicted. Based on what was surmised about Jupiter, a 5-Gauss magnetic field was assumed to exist. When Juno entered orbit and began its scientific measurements, levels as high as 9 Gauss were found. Compare those readings to Earth's 0.5 Gauss field, and the anomaly of Jupiter's electromagnetic energy can be deduced. Its field is so irregular, some astrophysicists to suggest that there is an anomalous structure in Jupiter's core. Recently, for example, Juno discovered jet streams on Jupiter that run further down into its atmosphere than previously thought. over 3,000 kilometers deep. Why the atmospheric bands are so deep is a mystery, since they have always been associated with superficial weather patterns. According to a recent press release, the south pole of Jupiter also exhibits an unusual grouping of phenomena. Under some simulated conditions, and on Saturn, cyclonic storms merge with one another instead of repelling each other. Multiple vortices encircle a central whirlpool of gas and dust. The structures are warmer than the surrounding cloud bands, but are still near absolute zero temperatures. Perhaps the Great Red Spot that has persisted for more than 300 years can provide additional clues to how the polar vortices are formed and stabilized. The consensus opinion is that it is a cyclonic storm driven by rising heat from below, because it is warmer than its surroundings. However, exactly how it was formed and why it has persisted for so long are mysteries. Wind speeds around its perimeter have been measured at 635 kilometers per hour, twice as fast as a terrestrial tornado. As previously written, Jupiter and its moon Io dissipate 2 trillion watts between them. That flow of electric charge causes lightning in Jupiter's upper atmosphere, along with auroras at the poles. Since Jupiter is obviously an electrical environment, it is there that some answers can be found. Rotating charging bodies produce dipolar electromagnetic fields, whether they are gas giants or rocky planets. Why some planets like Earth and Mercury possess magnetic fields, while Venus and Mars do not, demands further investigation. However, the basic physics of charged objects in motion generating electromagnetism is not debated. Plasma is not a substance. It is a state of matter. Any material can become a plasma if electrons are stripped from atomic nuclei, causing charge separation to occur. Whenever there are regions of opposite charge, and Juno team members detected a gravitational asymmetry inside Jupiter that most likely contributes to charge separation. Double layers will form, and an electric field will develop. An electric field, no matter how weak, accelerates charged particles. Depending on the characteristic of any given plasma, it will be affected differently by electricity. This could explain why the polar vortices are so distinct. Jupiter's electric field accelerates plasmas at different rates. Coupled with the cloud band observations, the massive cyclones exhibit distinct temperature bands, high wind speeds, and endurance. They appear to be more permanent fixtures. Charge separation in plasma could explain these anomalies. That's Stephen Smith.
Had a drastic effect on the system as a whole. The Saturnian planets were wrenched out of polar alignment as their respective spin rates accelerated in response to the Saturn system's displaced forward momentum. The multi-resonant state was suddenly broken, permanently upsetting the primeval state of our solar system. No longer axially synchronized, individual charge sheets formed around each planet as the conjoined plasmasphere of Jupiter and Saturn subdivided, electrically isolating them from one another. Saturn was displaced from its polar position, and the gaseous envelope surrounding the Saturnian planets began to disperse. As Velikovsky indicated, the increased distance between Earth and Saturn was most likely the result of both the removal of Earth from its place as well as Saturn from its place. The opening scenes of the divine spectacle would have been seen in the north skies, since Earth was still millions of miles below Saturn and Jupiter. But after Earth was released into a path of its own around the Sun, the plane of Earth's orbit would lift steadily, eventually reorienting at a steep inclination, crossing over the sun's equatorial current sheet twice a year at each equinox. Thus, the eyewitness perspective on Jupiter and Saturn shifted at this time, so that the unfolding drama panned from the northern skies to a side view of the sky gods receding away in the southern night sky. Derailed from their dynamically synchronized alignment, Jupiter and the large Saturnian planets immediately redirected their orbital momentums into elliptical outward-bound spirals. Nearly all myths of the fall tell of the disappearance of the gods into the deep night sky. A distinct parallel may also be drawn to the teachings on Zimzum, the first stage of creation described in the Kabbalah, the self-contraction, concealing, shrinkage, or retreat of the god's original form into a new dilation or opening of space. Steadily diminishing in size and luminosity, receding away from Earth in the inner solar system, hiding himself, withdrawing himself, entering into himself, the contraction of departing god Saturn cleared space for a new creation. The Kabbalah continues, that Zimzum, contraction, was completely uniform all around, so that it left a vacant space called Tihiru, an empty, hollow, uniformly circular on all sides. Until this time, our ancestors would have had no concept of limitless space extending away from the earth, because such conditions had never before been seen. Unfurling like a curtain drawn open, the old heavens progressively whirled away from earth on all sides. The primordial cosmic waters of the old Saturnian gaseous envelope retreated and withdrew, differentiating a deep open space in place of the rainy wall of clouds that shrouded earth in former times. The age of Jupiter, now upon the world, introduced mankind to the light of the stars in the darkness of the night. In Egypt it was Jupiter as Re who boasted, I am he who made the hours, so that days might come into being. Nuit was specifically the nighttime star-studded sky arched over the wide horizon, through which the red sun-like disk of Re journeyed each night. In the Iliad, Night herself apportioned Zeus's sovereignty to the wide heaven among the cloudy aether, a wide band of night sky centered on the ecliptic, from approximately 17 degrees north to approximately 17 degrees south. The way of Anu, likewise assigned to Jupiter as Marduk in the Near East. As the battling sky gods retreated through this expanding space into deeper and more distant reaches of the solar system, they discharged as brilliantly lit wandering stars, still huge in size, though far removed, lighting the night as nearby suns. All four outer giants still exhibit rotational speeds far out of proportion to their sizes. All four still emit significantly more energy than they receive from the sun, and they are in that sense stars even today. At first looming large near Earth, Jupiter became the new central body of the sky, more or less taking over Saturn's old identity. When Jupiter was first born, he defeated Saturn and the Sun by his brilliance, we are told in Vedic literature. It was then that Zeus became Lord of the bright skies. A stellar history for Jupiter was, in fact, much in vogue among mainstream astronomers through the 17th to 19th centuries, when popular astronomy famously speculated on the nature of Jupiter as a dark star, a hypothesis revived during the second half of the 20th century in light of the considerable implications suggested by data recovered from orbiting satellites and interplanetary explorers. Jupiter's wide-ranging variety of active emanations, infrared, radio, X-ray, and ultraviolet among them, have led others to consider Jupiter as a failed sun, or a star yet to be. Jupiter's volatile magnetosphere would continue to display dramatic plasma instabilities as it distributed an excess of voltage. Progressively acclimating to an outbound spiral orbit, Jupiter's appearance would have been stupendous in size, visibly larger than the daytime sun. Jupiter's massive magnetosphere, today 10 times stronger than that of any other planet and about 4 times as wide as the sun, would have fluoresced with brilliantly colored glow-mode plasma flows for some time thereafter, retaining enough of a mini-discharge to give a semblance of starhood. Below Jupiter's glowing globe appeared a long beard, mantle or cloak, trailing all the way to the horizon below, a stupendous plume of plasma extending away from Jupiter's south geographic pole. This plasma expulsion would have been primarily an inflow of electrons, but simultaneously also an outflow of protons and other dissociated ions. Appearing as a steep elongated cone, Jupiter's southern expulsion was also characterized as his royal mountain or throne of glory. In the Kabbalah, this appearance is remembered as the long-bearded Arik Anpin, the extended countenance of the newly crowned star god. He let out his throne above and stretched a part of his glory below. And the Ancient of Days did sit. His throne was fiery flame, and his wheels burning fire. For a cloak Marduk was wrapped in an armor of terror. With a fearsome halo his head was turbaned. On the other side of the world, Viracocha was similarly remembered as a tall, glowing, bearded man dressed in a long, flowing cloak, who came in a time of chaos to set the world to rights. The fluorescing debris appears to have assumed a highly flattened, disc-like or lenticular distribution over time, and still extends all the way to the orbit of Jupiter today. Sometimes referenced as zodiacal light, the ethereal fire waters of the dust cloud once extended some distance either side of the ecliptic plane, both obscuring as well as highlighting the fixed stars of the zodiac. Today the residual afterglow or countershine of the zodiacal cloud remains visible as a tall cone-shaped ribbon of soft light brightening on the plane of Earth's orbit before sunrise and after sunset. The interplanetary dust cloud as such represents the mortal remains of the primordial gaseous envelope dissipated during the collapse of the Saturnian configuration. Some of this debris may still remain suspended in the rings surrounding the giant planets. Earth would also wind up with its share of drifting dust and debris. Gas vapors, ionized meteoroids, and assorted celestial wreckage began falling through the magnetosphere with short-lived splendor. Heavier infalls of material through the ionosphere sparkled and fizzled out in the upper atmosphere as concentric circles and spirals aglow in the night. Migrating through the interplanetary cloud year-round, sweeping through the densest clouds of debris during each equinoctial pass through the solar current sheet, a near-Earth terrestrial dust cloud began to accumulate. Electrostatically suspended along Earth's equatorial plane, this dust cloud was sorted by the conductive sheaths of Earth's plasmasphere into rotating belts and rings. In the Zohar we read, "Then a great reservoir was formed out of the unfathomable deep, or tehom, just as if a huge hollow had been dug. This reservoir divided itself into 7 streams, resembling 7 long vessels, glimmering with a metallic sheen. All of them are in the form of concentric circles, like the layers of an onion, with rings inside each other." Most traditional mythologies retained memories of these earth rings. A rich profusion of descriptions handed down from remote antiquity and conserved to this day in several schools of esoteric thought have puzzled scholars and laymen alike for centuries. During the day, these debris rings appeared to some as concentric streams, rivers, or seas. To others, as a looming golden-green hill stretching from horizon to horizon, covered with wind-blown grasses. Some saw fields of wheat or beds of bamboo. Others beheld an expanse of beaten brass, a sea of reeds, or even an ocean standing in the southern sky. In Egypt they were known as the Duat, the realm traversed nightly by the red disk of Re. Encompassed by the darker waters of noon, the Duat was the famed court of the soul's last judgment, filled with a labyrinth of rivers, islands, fields, lakes of fire, mounds, caverns, metallic walls, and blue-green trees. In the Near East the rings were called the Absu, the sweet fresh waters bounded by the salty deep of Tiamat. In ancient Greece the rings were remembered as deep-eddying, back-flowing okeanos, who circled round the whole earth in 7, or some sources say 9, concentric streams, himself surrounded by his mate and companion Tethys. Earth itself, illuminated by the sun at an angle offset from the bands of debris, cast a long, dark, penumbral shadow across the rings, a virtual crack in the sky that would glide from horizon to horizon across the rings every night. This shadowy crevice would also appear to expand and contract each year. At the solstices, this shadow would resemble an arched doorway, cave entrance, valley, tunnel, or corridor, the door to the underworld.
The more I look around, the more confirmation I get that some sort of Saturn theory occurred in this solar system. We only know perhaps a glimmer, but as information continues to come out, we get to learn a little bit more. Things come into better focus when you learn why, for example, the number 7 is so prominent in civilizations. Because the glow of Saturn's nova lasted that long, with what looks like remnants of the actual nova still circling the former star today. That, to me, looks like it's a remnant of something. Perhaps it's not even former, or just dormant, suppressed by the sun. But one thing is for sure to me, both Jupiter and Saturn are filled with nothing but turmoil. Something brought that about. And both bodies give off more heat and energy than they receive, which is very little, if anything. All of the ancient myths that had to come out around the same time, give or take, are all telling the same story. When you really think about it, it's mind-boggling. One of the things we're pretty sure about is the order in which this drama played out, with Saturn replacing his father On, or Uranus, which completely infers or implies that there was a period for that to exist we know even less about. Then after Saturn came Jupiter, and man has spent his history copying what the stars did. As above, so below, I guess. My guess that period must have been prominent during the rise of Rome, with Mars having a brief turn along with Mercury and Venus, not to mention the moon. It was busy. But the smaller planets seemed to be much faster, but more deadly, with Venus and Mars duking it out like in the Iliad. When the ancients say Jupiter put his father in chains and dressed himself in bands and belts, the ancient North American natives called the planet Mars Scarface. How could they possibly have known these things? I don't know how it doesn't intrigue the mainstream to no end. But like electricity in space, we just don't talk about that. How will we ever learn? All of the electric arc machining evidence that goes ignored, it's really a shame. One more thing that we haven't tackled, and that's the gravity issue. A while back, I did a video with Theodore Holden, and I don't know if you know it or not, but he was the guy who formulated it out a long time ago that dinosaurs could not lift themselves off the ground in today's gravity. And it caused quite a backlash, but then they just swept it under the rug like everything else. But here's a snippet of a video I did with Ted where he explains the gravity in dinosaurs issue.
And I never thought about it before I heard it.
Yeah, see, Albert Einstein tried to describe gravity as a four-dimensional differential geometry sort of a thing. You cannot start with that and believe that gravity on the surface of our own planet ever could have changed terribly much within the last, say, 50 or 100,000 years. Yet it's a very easy demonstration that it has, and that a large dinosaur would simply be crushed by his own weight in our present world. Okay.
Yeah.
That is that's the situation with this square cubed problem that you heard me talk about. Weight is proportional to volume, which is a cubed figure, width times breadth times height.
Yes.
And strength is proportional to cross-section of bones and muscles, which is more like pi r squared. Okay, if you double your dimensions, you know, if you go to sleep at night and you're 6 feet tall, you wake up in the morning, you're 12 feet tall, and everything just got expanded by a factor of 2. Mm-hmm. That factor of 2 gets cubed for volume, width, breadth, height, 2, 4, age. It can be 8 times heavier. It's only going to be 4 times stronger. You'll have cut your weight ratio in half. And there's a limit to how many times you could ever cut your power to weight ratio in half and still be able to stand up and walk. And for the strongest human athletes that we know anything at all about, the limit is right around 20,000 pounds. For somebody like Magnuson or Bill Kazmaier, you know, somewhere right around 20,000 pounds, it would become the same level of effort just to stand up as it is to do one of those 1,000-pound squats or deadlifts at the normal weight of 350 or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, that's a game changer. I mean, that should slap somebody in the face right there.
It did, right? And it's like, you know, there was a huge controversy over that. Like 30 years ago, I was the only person on the planet saying anything like that. Nowadays, I think most people agree. Mm-hmm. You know, they've done the math. It's like they've listened to the arguments, and I think most people agree with me that you couldn't have large dinosaurs walking around in today's world. There's 2 reasons why anybody would ever talk about an Earth, you know, expanding Earth theories, right? One would have to do with dinosaurs. The other would have to do with the tectonic plates of the ancient supercontinent, Pangaea. Right. Okay. You know, the tectonic plates of Pangaea wouldn't fit on a planet. You know, that they appear as if they would require a planet of greater curvature, a smaller planet, right? But there's another way of explaining that, right? In other words, you've got the Earth sitting there underneath the dwarf star with its pole pointed straight out the dwarf star. It's going to get pulled into an egg shape, right? You know, it's not going to be spherical the way it is now. Okay, it's like Pangaea was simply sitting there at the high point of the egg. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that would explain the greater curvature. Now, as far as dinosaurs go, like I say, you couldn't have it. It's like, you know, if you put a sauropod dinosaur next to Bill Kazmaier at equal sizes, then what you're seeing is one creature at the top of the food chain, the other pretty near the bottom, right? In other words, Kazmaier's body is 90% bone and muscle, right? And that's trained as well as you ever could have muscle trained. And the brachiosaur's body is mostly gut and digestive system for processing leaves and grass, right? And I mean, if Kazmaier couldn't make it 20,000 pounds in our present world, then a brachiosaur sure as hell couldn't.
Yeah, I heard they had 3 hearts in their neck just to pump the blood.
No, it's ridiculous. You've got 2 problems with dinosaurs and then with large dinosaurs, sauropods on their necks, right? And you've got 2 kinds of sauropod dinosaurs. You've got like brachiosaurids, which, according to the bones, apparently held their necks upwards, and then you've got the diplodocids, which, you know, would have held their necks outwards, or at least that's what the bones indicate. Okay. Either way, you've got an insurmountable problem, right? It's like, in the case of the brachiosaurids, it's everything. You know, in other words, the limiting value of something like that in our present world is the giraffe, right? Now, you know, it takes a gigantic amount of blood pressure to get blood to a giraffe's brain. Okay, and the giraffe has this very, very tight skin, which acts like a pressure suit, you know, like for a fighter pilot.
They have a heart in their neck.
And basically, I mean, a giraffe's blood pressure would blow our vascular system apart. While, you know, he's trying to get blood to a brain which is 20 feet high. I mean, what is some sauropod going to do to try to get blood to a brain which is 60 feet high? Experts claim that would put, you know, the brachiosaurids in the position of just being constantly at risk for some kind of a circulatory system disaster, right? Now, that's no way to go through life, you know, especially if you're trying to rule the world for 60 million years or something like, you know.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense. So they're claiming, well, it must be that, like, what the bones are telling us is wrong. They must have all just held their necks outwards, and the diplodocids apparently did hold their necks outwards. But in that case, you're dealing with a problem which is just as bad or worse, and I think is worse. You're talking about torque, right? Because you've got a creature with a neck which is 60 feet long, okay? And if the and that neck could weigh 50 or 60,000 pounds, right? And if the center of gravity of that neck is even 10 feet out from the shoulders, you know, then you're talking about 500,000 foot-pounds of torque and on up, right? Now, what is there in our normal life which corresponds to 500,000 foot-pounds of torque? The answer is nothing. I mean, as far as like any kind of a nut or a bolt or anything that screws together with that much torque. You know, what you would really be talking, the one thing in the earth which would be ballpark for that kind of torque would be like the combined maximum torque of all 4 of the engines of an Iowa-class battleship. There would be enough torque to drive a 65,000-ton warship through the water at 35 knots.
Yeah.
Okay, and you're going to hold that with some kind of a structure made out of flesh and blood?
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
No, so there's no way for a large dinosaur to hold his neck in our present gravity, and that problem, if somebody ever really was able to do the math for it, which I have not been able to do, would almost certainly be a bigger problem than the question of gravity, you know, just being able to support weight, you know, on land. They used to think dinosaurs, you know, the large ones would have lived in water, but they had no adaptation for that. They would have needed snowshoe feet, right? In other words, the feet they actually have would just sink straight into muddy river bottoms. You know, they would take 3 steps to be immobilized.
So what happened?
Yeah, gravity changed.
It was Velikovsky's claim that only a few thousand years ago, a period of chaos reigned in the solar system. One of the planets closely associated with Earth was Saturn, and watery filaments rained on our planet following Saturn's violent flare-up. Decades later, based on the respective research of Dave Talbot and Eduardo Cardona, Thornhill developed his own model of a primordially close relationship between Earth and Saturn, which was the source of all the water in our oceans, while leaving remnants in its rings. Today, Thornhill continues his presentation, shifting his focus to his own successful predictions for the Saturnian system, including the mysterious moon Titan.
Before I tell the epic story, a warning. Our education systems train students to memorize a litany of facts, which produces global groupthink. Students are not given the time or encouragement to critically examine the history of ideas. A leading researcher into the learning functions of the divided brain, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, has shown such blinkered left hemisphere training renders students functionally blind to alternative ways of looking at a problem. The left hemisphere simply blocks out everything that doesn't fit with its take. It doesn't see it, actually, at all. So scientists with their narrow specialised training may look at but cannot see what to a non-expert may seem obvious. They will be the last to see a paradigm shift in the making. This is particularly evident for electrical phenomena in space. Even the Nobel Prize-winning founder of the idea of an electric universe, Hans Wolfgang, was ignored when he warned in his 1970 acceptance speech of an inevitable crisis in astrophysics if electric circuits in space are not recognized. Houston, we still have that problem after almost 50 years. I have lived since a teenager with uncertainty about accepted truths and learned to have the courage to challenge them. The result is not chaos, but a synthesis of ideas that explains the old ideas better and finds new ways of incorporating what seems a chaos of anomalies. And the best test is that of classical physics. Simplification. The resulting paradigm shift is not a threat but an invitation to the greatest adventure we may ever know, to begin to understand our real place in the universe for the first time. In our electric universe, stars and planets are formed at the same time inside molecular clouds, along a snaking cosmic lightning bolt. Gravity plays no role in the process. Since cosmic lightning takes the form of a twisted pair of current filaments, it is found that most stars are in pairs, or multiples. Planets will tend to do the same. Like the snaking filaments in a novelty plasma ball, the star-forming filament moves on, leaving a string of massive objects behind to gravitationally form the weird and theoretically challenging zoo of exoplanetary systems recently discovered. Some gas giant planets are subsequently formed in close orbits about a star that has ejected charged matter to achieve stability with a changed electrical environment. The ejection flares may account for the flickering of newborn stars, which can't be explained by gravitational accretion. This explains the unexpected hot Jupiter seen in large numbers closely orbiting other stars. The most numerous stars in the galaxy, brown dwarfs, which would appear reddish if they could be seen with the naked eye, are generally classed as failed stars, yet they have the baffling ability to produce massive stellar flares. This is simply explained because red stars don't have the ability of main-sequence bright stars to control their current by a transistor-like action in their photospheric plasma. A brown dwarf can only respond by discharging matter electrically. The capture process of a brown dwarf star involves flaring and ejection of charged matter by that body in order to achieve a new electrical equilibrium in its adopted family. That accounts for the large number of close-orbiting moons of our captured gas giants in remote orbits. With this in mind, I want to take you back to just before the famous Cassini-Huygens space probe was to arrive at Saturn on July 1st, 2004. In news reports, Saturn was dubbed the original Lord of the Rings. There is a profound truth behind such a glib turn of phrase, but it wasn't until the advent of the telescope that Christian Huygens in 1656 was able to suggest that Saturn had a ring. So how do we explain the Saturnian ring symbolism that pervades our cultures? The halo of the saints, the royal crown, and the ring given in marriage are Saturnian symbols, as are the circled or Celtic cross, the Egyptian Ansate cross or Ankh, the Eye of Ra, and the astronomically baffling star inside the crescent. The star at the top of the lighted Christmas tree is pure Saturnian imagery. It is truly amazing that we are still haunted by prehistoric archetypes. It helps us to understand the extraordinary archetypal attraction of Tolkien's fantasy of Lord of the Rings. He was well versed in mythology. The following description of events is based on the surprisingly detailed and truly remarkable scholarship of Talbot and Cardona, which required explanations with the physics of an electric universe. Let's call our primordial star Proto-Saturn. It was an independent brown dwarf with its own entourage of satellites, including the Earth, Mars, and Titan. Proto-Saturn's dim reddish light was due to a glowing red anode plasma sheath, much larger than the Sun, enclosing Proto-Saturn and its inner satellites in a radiant cell. The term dwarf star is purely theoretical, since they are difficult to see and measure. In fact, NASA reported a brown dwarf which was radiating as if it had twice the expected surface area. The environment inside the radiant red shell is most hospitable for life on any enclosed satellites because there are no seasons, and water is conspicuous in the spectra of such stars. Water misted down on this planet continually, and red light is ideal for photosynthesis, which explains the abundance of ferns and other vegetation globally in the Carboniferous era. But there is a catch. Brown dwarf stars are known to flare, sometimes to the extent, as one astronomer commented, that any satellites would suffer a very bad day. Such flaring by Proto-Saturn accounts for the geological strata and the fossil record of a number of global mass extinctions and instant burial of dismembered plant and animal remains. As we approached the Sun from deep space, our plasma sheath flickered like a faulty electric light when the two stellar plasma sheaths, or magnetospheres, began to clash. Proto-Saturn's galactic electrical power was usurped by the Sun, and its appearance changed dramatically. Before dimming forever, the dwarf star Proto-Saturn would have flared brilliantly like a comet, ejecting charged matter to relieve the electrical stresses caused by the sudden change in environment. Even now the former star has not completely cooled. Saturn still radiates more than twice the heat it receives from the Sun. And we have a simple explanation for the origin of Saturn's mysteriously short-lived water-ice rings. As the Proto-Saturnian system approached the Sun in the outer solar system, our minor star's gravitational sphere of influence steadily shrank, and its outer satellites were progressively stripped away. This, and the earlier capture of the other gas giants, provides the source of trans-Neptunian objects, as they're known, including Pluto with its unexpected geology and atmosphere, and its peculiar moons. There is a simple physical characteristic that links a captured star with its offspring. It is the axial tilts. Like our close-orbiting moon, satellites tend to orbit their primary with the same face always turned toward it. If they orbit in the equatorial plane, their spin axis will be aligned with that of the primary. As gyroscopes, the satellites will retain the same tilt even if jolted from their orbit, although the process may induce a wobble of the spin axis. It is therefore highly significant that the two key planets identified in the ancient pantheons, Saturn and Mars, have axial tilts closely similar to that of the Earth. The tilt of Saturn at 27 degrees to the ecliptic plane is itself an enigma, unless it formed independently from the Sun. Venus was described as a spectacular discharging body in the ancient congregation of planets. It can be explained if Venus was ejected in the flare-up of Proto-Saturn and the infall of the stream of ejected matter from swiftly rotating Proto-Saturn gave Venus a slow retrograde spin. The magnitude of the axial tilt of Venus to the ecliptic is much less than Saturn's, which suggests that Venus was ejected from a low latitude. This accounts for the hellish temperature and new surface of Venus, having been recently spat from the mantle of a brown dwarf star. Its filamentary equatorial scars caused by spectacular radial discharging, and its thick atmosphere inherited from the brown dwarf and subsequently modified by interplanetary and cometary discharges. Venus still has a cometary magnetotail stretching to the Earth's orbit, and its mountain tops glow with plasma discharges, which return Magellan's radar signals as unexplained shininess. It has a surprisingly young surface that gave rise to ad hoc theories of resurfacing events. They're unnecessary. Venus is a baby. Since my predictions were written in 2004, the electrogravity model has been further developed, and it explains electrogravitational capture and the rounding of cometary orbits by electrical discharge. It explains the huge capture cross-section of stars and why the observed phenomenal discharging of cometary Venus caused it to finally have the most circular orbit of any planet.
The catastrophes described in ancient sources were traumatic experiences common to all mankind. Purged from conscious memory, these records are now interpreted as allegories, metaphors, and the trauma has been submerged in the unconscious. Velikovsky calls this collective amnesia. A revolutionary theory of the universe based on the records of the past has challenged the fundamental beliefs of modern science for more than 2 decades. Today, the unexpected findings of space explorations have confirmed many of the predictions of this theory, but the man who proposed it, Emanuel Velikovsky, is still rejected by established science.
Well, I've taken a lot, but they're not very good. You're in too close for most of them.
And if I transgressed and went into many fields of science and humanities, it was not because I was born a rebel. I was coerced to trespass. The belief that we are living in an orderly universe, that nothing happened to this Earth and the other planets since the beginning, that nothing will happen till the end, is a wishful thinking that fills the textbooks, and your textbooks are still of Victorian vintage. Is any physicist here who would stand up and defend the proposition that only gravitation and inertia are in action in the solar system. But of all my heresies, this was the greatest. And let me ask you another question. Is the theory of uniformitarianism, which means that nothing what happened in the past could have happened if it doesn't happen today. On this is built the modern geology. On this is built the modern astronomy. On this is built the modern biology and theory of evolution. And so it is only wishful thinking that we are living in a safe, never perturbed solar system on a safe, never perturbed Earth.
Mountains were born and mountains collapsed. Land and sea changed places. Great streams of lava flowed. The sea boiled and evaporated. Such were the scenes of unimaginable violence during the times of global catastrophe.
talk to you for a bit. Yeah, that was really fun to make these two videos, and with the help, of course, of great videos from Thunderbolts and from everythingiselectric.com. I'd like to thank them very much. All the links to the real videos will be in the description. I'll come out and say hi in a minute. didn't see the live streamer. All right, do we got some people? Oh yeah, we got 35. Hold on a second. I gotta change the, yeah, that's it. There we go. So, how is everyone doing tonight? Another great Sunday, thank you. You're welcome. Hey, alchemy. Is it alchemy? Is that how you pronounce it? Strange days. Strange days, that's cool. Ancient history criticisms. Good to see you. You're hanging. You're hanging tough. Skywalker. That's cool. Somebody else. Clever. There's Bipolar Dilly. And how you doing, bub? Ancient history criticisms. Yabardo 562. New Justice Henry. Is Bipolar still around? Ray Carr's still here. Woo 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 woo. He's been here since the premiere. Len Benson. Good to meet you, Len. St. Pauli girl, is she still here? Pizza Monster. You're welcome, Pizza Monster. That's a pretty cool name. I could relate to that. I love pizza, man. Pineapple and pepperoni. J-Knot. J-Knot. That's funny. There's Beatles. He was here. Yes, I'm back. But who knows? This could have been a while ago. I don't know if anyone is still here from the start. I can't respond. Hey Grouch, what's up? I can't respond when I'm playing a video because I have it on full screen. If I deviate, it will take me off, you know. I did have a phone, but well, it broke. I gotta get a new phone. So I'll probably get one, I don't know, tomorrow or something. But I'm losing people as I talk. So what do you guys, you want to see something else, or I don't know, maybe I should just call it a night. It's been pretty successful. Thank you. You're welcome, Sean. I hate leaving, but I'll tell you what, I'm gonna look for something I have, and if I have it, then I'll play it. But just give me a couple of minutes to find it. All right, I'll be right back.
You don't know me.
Mythological deeds. Yet the ancient mythologies of the Chaldeans, the Greeks, the Romans, the Hindus, the Mayans, preoccupied themselves not with the sun or the moon, but prima facie with the planets. Marduk, the great god of the Babylonians, was the planet Jupiter. So was Ammon of the Egyptians, Zeus of the Greeks, and Jupiter of the Romans. It was much superior to Shamash, Helios, the sun. Why was it revered by all peoples? Why was the planet Mars chosen to be the personification of the god of war? Why did Kronos of the Greeks, Saturn of the Romans, play a part in hundreds of myths and legends? Thoth of the Egyptians, Nebo and Nergal of the Babylonians, Mithra and Mazda of the Persians, Vishnu and Shiva of the Hindus, Bachi-Palazzi and Quetzalcoatl of the Mexicans were a personification of planets. Innumerable hymns were dedicated to them and adventures and exploits ascribed to them. The life of our planet has its real source in the sun, wrote E. Renan. All force is a transformation of the sun. Before religion had gone so far as to proclaim that God must be placed in the absolute and the ideal, that is to say, outside of the world, one cult only was reasonable and scientific, and that was the cult of the sun. But the sun was subordinate to the planets, even though they are not conspicuous, poor sources of light, and no sources of warmth. The night sky illuminated by stars is majestic. The geometrical figures of the constellations such as Pleiades, Orion, the Great Bear, rolling from east in the evening to west before morning, are favorite motifs in poetry, no less than the sun and the moon. But the discrepancy in the choice of motifs by the ancients becomes still more obvious. The constellations of the sky took only a minor and incidental part in the mythology of the ancient peoples. The planets were the major gods, and they rule the universe. It is not easy to understand the idea, which was the basis for the identification of the Babylonian gods with the planets, writes an author. But the same process of identification of major gods with the planets can be found in the religions of the peoples in all parts of the world. The planets were not affiliated to the gods or symbols of the gods. They were the gods. In prayers and liturgies, they were invoked as gods. The greater gods, even when addressed by the name in prayer, were regarded as astral powers. This or that planet is selected according to the text of the prayer from the multitude of the stars of heaven to receive a gift. The planetary gods are much the most powerful of all. Their positions in the sky, their reciprocal relations, have a decisive influence on all physical and moral phenomena of the world. The great majority of us moderns pay no attention to these points in the night sky, and probably not 1 in 10 or even in 100 is able to point to Jupiter or Mars in the firmament. The planets changed their places, but not conspicuously. Were they indebted for their deification to this slow movement by which they differ from the fixed stars? Did Zeus, Jupiter, Marduk, Ammon become the supreme deity, the thunderer and dreadful lord of the universe, only because of his slow movement? He passes in 12 years the cycle of the zodiac, traversed by the sun in 24 hours, and by the moon even quicker. When seen with the naked eye, the planet Jupiter distinguishes itself from the fixed stars of first magnitude only by this slow change of position. Augustine, confused by the problem of the deification of the planets, wrote in the 4th century, "But possibly these stars which have been called by their names are these gods. They call a certain star Mercury, and likewise a certain other star Mars. But among those stars which are called by the name of gods is that one which they call Jupiter, and yet with them Jupiter is the world. There also is that one they call Saturn, and yet they give him no small property beside, namely all seeds. Mercury, the closest to the sun, is barely visible, being hidden in the sun's rays. But the ancients made the planet Mercury into a great god, Hermes or Nebo. Why was it feared and worshipped? What is there generally in the planets to inspire awe, so as to influence people to build temples for them, to sing liturgies, to bring sacrifices, to narrate legends, and to dedicate to them the domain of science, of war, of agriculture? The key to this problem, which is the major problem of all classical mythology, is already in our hands. The planet Venus was deified because of its dramatic appearance and because of the havoc it brought to the world, as described in Worlds in Collision. I illuminated also the events which made Mars a feared god. Divine qualities were ascribed to the other planets because of the catastrophes they wrought in earlier ages. In the Persian holy books, it is said that on the planets depends the existence or non-existence of the world. Wherefore are they especially to be venerated? The 7 planets rule the universe, says a Nabatean inscription. The Greeks and Romans believed that everything is in fact subject to the changes brought about by the revolutions of the stars. The celestial orbs, by their combined movements, are the authors of all that was and is to come. According to ancient Hebrew traditions, there are 7 archangels, each of whom is associated with a planet. The 7 archangels were believed to play an important part in the universal order through their associations with the planets. The reason for the deification of the planets lay in the fact that the planets, only a short time ago, were not faultlessly circling celestial bodies, nor were they harmless. This is also expressed in a Mandean text. How cruel are the planets to stay there and conspire evil in their rage. The planets conspire in rage against us. Yes, Velikovsky. I have 2 more short ones. They fit in, so I might as well put them in. References. These identifications are discussed below, Part 4, Jupiter of the Thunderbolt. That's the chapter I'm about to get into. I've been reading in the beginning. For ancient planetary worship among the Babylonians, among the Egyptians,
Astronomische und Astrologische Inschriften alt Ägyptische Denkmäler Leipzig 1883 E-Novel The Destruction des Hommes par les Dieux Transactions of the Society for Biblical Archaeology IV 1875 pp.
Haha, he can read all the tough words.
Norgebauer and Apaka, Egyptian Astronomical Texts, London, 1969. Among the Hebrews, C.M. Seligson, Star Worship in the Jewish Encyclopedia, New York, 1905, cf. L. Ginsberg, The Legends of the Jews, Philadelphia, 1925, Volume 3, p. 371, Volume 6.
Among the Persians, see the
Dabistan.
The Dabistan. Babylonian Magic and Sorcery, London, 1896. L.W. King. I'd like to get a hold of that book. Maybe not. I don't know. The City of God, 1907, by M. Dodds. This was the teaching of Anaxagoras, as reported. Diogenes. The world tells us that it was Jupiter who put these rings around Saturn. They may have some other components too. Since what happened? It just... Ah! It didn't like it. Audio render error. Oh boy. Well, it's like that on all of them. It looks like I'm done. It's telling me I'm done, folks. I guess it's saying audio render error. I don't know. I've never gotten that before in my life. But, you know, where's the analog? I miss my analog. Well, everybody, I guess that's it. You know, when I first started doing this stuff, I was playing that music way too loud, and everybody was so nice, nobody even told me. I had to get more experience to find out. Belly dancers? You want belly dancers? I got belly dancers. The only problem is we're going to have to close down and restart.